Niteshad, you ready?
I am ready. Well, I am ready with one exception. I'm trying to figure out. Oh, we're there. Okay, awesome. Because I see another window there that's apparently. Yep. On the conference bridge can hear me well. I hope. Here we go. Can everybody on the conference bridge hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Great. Awesome. So yeah, it's Cyberwar and how I learned to stop worrying and fight the fear, uncertainty, and doubts. This is the Cyberwar in question. I won this book, Cyberwar, The Next Threat to National Security and What to Do About It, by Richard A. Clarke, a couple months ago.
I thought I could just mute one. Starts out well.
So it starts out well, and then it just descends. It's kind of like reading Dante's Inferno. You just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into hell. That's literary illusion.
Tweet that quick.
And if you know Richard A. Clarke's Twitter handle, that'd be even more epic. So anyway, why is this not? There we go.
I'm just worried about dropping the call.
Yeah. There we go. So are we good on the call, or what's going on?
Yeah, we're good on the call.
Okay, awesome. So with that, he starts out with several examples of actual. I'm using his term cyberwar. I personally prefer the term network-centric combat or something like that, because that's really what you're talking about. You know, we all know there's no there, especially without virtual reality or anything like that. So it would make Chris's version of cyber much more interesting, right? So anyway, there's several actual incidents in recent history that where various nations have used actual network attacks as part of larger military conflict. And that's the thing I would like to personally point out, is that there's not an incident where where a nation or a non-state actor has really, well, I guess anonymous if you count the lower ion cannon, but you know, there's not been a really sophisticated attack that hasn't been obviously in support of someone else's foreign policy agenda, or indeed their own. I guess the current phrase of the art is kinetic action, but let's just call that combat. Like there's actually boots on the ground. There's actual warfighters fighting in all of these examples. Well, maybe not in the first one. There's no boots on the ground. But so on September 6, 2007, Israel decided that it didn't like the fact that Syria was covertly building a nuclear reactor about 75 miles from the Syrian-Turkish border, and they decided to do something about that. Another one is Russia decided to launch a distributed denial of service attack on Estonia on April 27, 2007. And then, you know, little over a year later, when they were in the conflict over South Ossetia, I think that's how you pronounce that, in Georgia. Well, it used to be Georgia, now it's in Russia. They used DDoS attacks and a few other attacks to support the rebels who were fighting there and their own military. And North Korea, always staying classy, decided to try to DDoS the U.S. and South Korea over several days in July 2009. And we'll cover some of these in a little bit greater detail. So, like I said earlier, the reactor in Syria, which was being built by North Korean workers, it's always interesting how these people kind of, you know, ally themselves. It's about 75 miles it's on the Euphrates River, about 75 miles from the Syrian-Turkish border. The Israeli Air Force decided to attack it approaching from the north over Turkish airspace, so they're coming in from the direction that the Syrians aren't expecting. However, what was interesting about the attack is afterwards, when the reactor was a smoking crater, in fact, when the arms inspectors showed up, all they could find were fragments about yay big, some of which were actually radioactive, which was kind of the proof they were looking for. The Syrian radar operators reported that they didn't see anything coming in on their radar scopes. That it always just showed, the usual traffic of airliners or cargo flights or that sort of thing, but no huge squadron of F-15s and F-16s with, Stars of David on their tails. And what appears to have happened is that somehow, and really no one knows exactly how the Israelis infiltrated the Syrian radar network, but they managed to infiltrate the network, hack into all of the radar equipment, and selectively blot out their aircraft. And then, so therefore, there was no early warning that the Syrians had. He doesn't mention this in the book, but I'm a fan of military history, and I just couldn't help resist comparing this to the Bekaa Valley campaign during the Yom Kippur War. Basically, Israel did the same thing there, but with a little bit lower tech twist. Just as their attack aircraft were flying north into Lebanon, they sent a bogus radio message that faked that it appeared to be from Lebanon's high command saying, we're worried about the Israelis coming in and attacking, we're worried about them using an ECM attack on the radar, so to prevent damage to the radar receivers, shut down your radars and keep them shut down until you receive a command from us to turn them back on. And right at that moment, after all the radar scopes stop receiving, they're still transmitting, so that's why the missiles are going to hit them because they're riding in on the radio waves. I'm not kidding. The Israelis pulled this off, so they basically social engineered all the Lebanese radar operators and turning off the receivers so they could blow them away and not lose any aircraft. And then, and like in the book, I think Eric S. Raymond had NORAD's number at one point. But yeah, so, and really, of all the attacks we're going to talk about, this is by far the most sophisticated. The only one, and I don't mention it specifically, the only one that I think is more sophisticated is Stuxnet. But the book was published before that, so, and I don't think anybody really knows all of the details about how Stuxnet operated.
So, with this attack, did we have any confirmation that is actually that? He said that's what it appears to happen. It's very attacked into that.
Well, there's the Mossad is notoriously tight-lipped about these sorts of things. So, in all these cases, this is this is what appears to have happened. Nobody's going to admit, oh yeah, we've got this new capability where we can attack electronic devices at will from a distance or whatever. And Clarke goes through several different possibilities about what may have happened. The ones that I think are more probable are that agents may have infiltrated the country and then attacked something like a fiber transfer node or something like that directly so that they could have injected software into it, like a virus or a worm, that would have specifically targeted the hardware it needed. He goes into more stuff like, that there could have been a stealth UAV that was broadcasting on a certain frequency and then somehow overloaded the receiver on the radar and jumped the gap and then reprogrammed it that way. And I'm like, I don't think you understand how these things work, Richard. I really, really don't. Knowing InfoSec and also knowing RF, if you can do that, you don't need to bomb stuff.
Yeah. Got a question in the channel from Ray Davidson regarding the Bekaa Valley campaign. Do you have a reference to that if people want to find out more about Bekaa Valley and that particular incident?
Not off the top of my head. And I've seen it spelled different ways. I've seen V-E-K-A and V-E-K-K-A. So I would say search Wikipedia is the best thing I can come up with. But I've known about that for years, and I've forgotten the source that I learned about it. And it was just long before this. It was just so interesting to me that they had social engineered their opponents at that level.
B-E-Q-A-A.
The EQAA? Okay. Okay.
And this, and speaking of Wikipedia, this particular incident with the Syria nuclear reactor is what, Operation Orchard, I think. Wikipedia.
Okay. That was not used in his book, so that's all of what I'm going mostly on his source here. But are we good on this one? Can we move on to the next one? Okay. So this is also well, it's interesting because of how it starts. Estonia was Soviet satellite. Well, originally it was its own free country, and then the Soviets are kind of dicks, and they took it over as part of World War II. And as part of that, they, like every place else they marched through, they decided to leave a huge bronze statue of a Russian soldier, a Red Army soldier, which typically was on top of one of their mass graves of the soldiers who had died there. I can't remember if it's Estonia or if it's the one in Austria, but it's nicknamed the only soldier who didn't rape our women by the locals. So these are not, like, the Russians think these are awesome, but the people who are there really don't like them. And there was some kind of tension. Basically, what Estonia wanted to move the memorial. They didn't want to take it down. They're like, look, can we just move it because it's in the middle of this intersection, and we want to enlarge the road or something like that. And we'll be respectful. We'll move the graves to another site. And you basically had ethnic Russians in Estonia and the Estonians getting into higher and higher tensions over this. And eventually a riot broke out between these two groups with the police in the middle trying to defend the monument, which I find this all kind of crazy. And it's important to note that Estonia has a level of network infrastructure built out similar to South Korea. They're not quite to the South Korean level, but they're an incredibly wired country. And just so happened that the night of the riot, a little bit later on, all the most used web pages in Estonia get hit by an enormous DDoS attack. And then after that happened, the botnet moves on and starts targeting stuff that your average person isn't going to know how to get to, like the telephone switches, like the actual, their maintenance ports on the telephone network and the credit card validation system and other critical infrastructure. At this point, Estonia kind of screams for help, and in Clarke's words, well, I'll substitute infosec for the word he's going to use, but basically they get infosec experts from the U.S. and the rest of Europe to kind of help them do disaster mitigation, not just recovery. They're trying to stop this as it's going on. And in the process of trying to put the lid on this enormous DDoS attack, they are able to trace where the botnets, where each individual bots are coming from, and then monitor them and find out where they're talking to for their controllers and who's talking to the controllers, and they trace that ultimately back to an IP address in Russia. And they eventually get a copy of the code and note that whoever wrote the code, they had used the Cyrillic alphabet keyboard, which none of this is, of course, conclusive that it was Russia, but those are Russian fingerprints. And of course, Russia says that this was a hacktivist. This was, someone in Russia who just wanted to help out the cause. That's usually what Russia says. And in some cases, it's true. Basically, it's difficult to tell where Russian organized crime ends and their intelligence services begin, and all of the Russian hackers, well, I won't say all, but the vast majority of Russian hackers who are very good, if they're not working for the government, they're working for organized crime. Mm. So a lot of times, I've lost track of what their intelligence service is called. KGB, FSB, it's called something else now, but they keep changing the name, but it's the same group of guys. But a lot of times that group, their intelligence service, will use the plausible deniability of, this person we're talking to, or this person did this on his own, we don't have a connection to him, and they're right, because he's connected to organized crime, which is connected to them somehow, and obviously information is flowing there, but it's not a provable channel. And then moving on to the South Ossetia, my Russian.
The news is always called Estonia.
Ossetia? Okay, we'll go with that. Ossetia. South Ossetia campaign in July 2008. I believe this is after South Ossetia had splintered away from Georgia. But at a certain point, rebels started staging missile raids from South Ossetia into Georgia. And Georgia at that point responds with military action and invades. And when they do that, Russia's like, wait, you know, this is now our territory. You've invaded us. And obviously that was a setup, or at least to me it's obvious. And then Russia invades Georgia to establish a buffer zone. Simultaneous to Russian troops crossing the border, a DDoS attack, strangely enough, takes down Georgian media outlets and blocks Georgia's access to CNN and BBC. Shortly after that, all the government websites get hit, and the president's website is, they put up a bunch of images comparing him to Hitler and things like that. You know, that they're basically trying to wage like a psychological operation that way.
Yes, psychological operation indeed. They changed the president to Hitler, and they only let them watch Fox News.
Or TASS. They can watch TASS.
Oh, TASS too. And then the next step is that Georgia's link to the internet, which passes through Turkey, is DDoSed. And there's so much traffic flooding that effectively Georgia lost control of the .ge domain. So now they can't even control their little part of DNS. And that makes Dan Kaminsky cry. I really need Road Clown and her depressed DNS Dan meme right now. But that's not going. That's not working yet. So, but anyway, yeah. So basically, you know, now it's gone from they've got websites hit to now they can't get on the internet, and someone else has captured their domain on DNS and is doing what they want, what they like to it. And so, as a result of this, Georgia's banking sector opts for the strategy in nuclear war called, you know, ride out. So basically, we're just going to batten down the hatches and hope for the best that we can eventually have something left, because they're worried that if they stay up, they're going to be subject to massive identity theft, which is not that, you know, I mean, Russian organized crime likes identity theft, right? So, and they're a bank. So, I mean, it was, in a certain sense, in a certain way, it made sense. But as a result of that, Russia is like, well, now you've taken the bait. Now we're going to launch a false flag distributed denial of service attack that appears to everybody else in the financial sector like it's coming from your banks. And so that causes all of the foreign banks to, you know, most of their systems are automatically detecting the DDoS, and they're severing the connection, probably at the firewall level or whatever, to Georgia's banking sector. So now Georgia's financial sector is completely offline. And all of this happened over the course of like 2 or 3 days. And really, Georgia was brought to its knees by these attacks. The thing that I would note, though, is while the strategy behind the attacks were sophisticated, it was particularly the one that was, you know, these couple of times where they're using deception and then exploiting the reaction to that deception. That seems fairly sophisticated. But all of these are, you know, botnets spread by viruses, controlled by, you know, a control network someplace else, and then they're all just doing either, you know, mass wgets or pings or, you know, the usual DDoS stuff. It's not like shutting down the radar in Syria. Yeah.
But, you know, Clarke, the thing that he keeps saying in the book is there's yet more sophisticated attacks out there. We need to be worried about all this stuff. And I'm like, people are doing pretty much meat and potatoes stuff here. I mean, you know, it's not, I'm not seeing, you know, Neo all of a sudden popping into being and stuff happening there between him and Agent Smith. I don't get this. And then this one, I find this one pretty funny because now Clarke interprets it as a warning shot, a shot across the bow, but I put it in the context of like North Korea's
nuclear tests that didn't have a high enough yield to actually have gone critical, or they're missile tests that apparently they like big fireworks. I don't know. I don't know if those are missiles or if they just want to watch something blow up a few minutes after takeoff. I'm not sure, but you know. But anyway, between July 4th and July 9th, 2009, North Korea initiates a DDoS attack against the U.S. Treasury, Secret Service, Federal Trade Commission, Department of Transportation, Department of Homeland Security. I think I got them all. There might have been a few more, at least in the government. And for certain parts of that time, different of these websites are down, but the amount of time that they're down is like several minutes. It's not like, because like the botnet they're using had between 40,000 and 166,000 individual PCs in it. It wasn't very large. And they're trying to take down some significant infrastructure there.
And also, to that point, working in a financial institution in July of 2009, those are like the websites that clients go to. That didn't affect any financial trading, didn't affect any real things. You know, people can get to the website.
Yeah.
Money was still flowing.
Kind of like Randall Monroe talking about an XKCD where the CIA website was dropped. And everybody, it's like what normal people hear. Oh my God, hackers hacked the CIA. What hackers hear? Oh, the CIA's billboard on the web was knocked over.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, and then it's kind of mixed, but while they were trying to attack the government, they decided to also attack NASDAQ, New York Mercantile Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, and the Washington Post. So you've got, Russians trying to attack CNN and BBC, and the North Koreans apparently hate the Washington Post, but not the New York Times, and not the Wall Street Journal, and not the LA Times or the Chicago Tribune. Okay. Clarke, he's very, very proud of the fact that this DDoS, which also attacked the White House, that it failed because he had previously pointed out the weakness because he was advisor to Obama and to, I think, I know he was an advisor to Clinton. I think he was an advisor to George W. Bush, and then an advisor to either Reagan or George Herbert Walker Bush. I forget which, but he's been a security advisor to 4 administrations now. And somewhere in there, he put through a policy at the White House that their website is able to be rapidly switched to the Akamai system. Yes. And so when the initial one was being attacked, they flipped back to the Akamai mirrors, and only their mirror in Asia, close to North Korea, had any problems whatsoever. North Korea kind of noticed this, the fact that, their attack was kind of weak. So they decided to launch 2 more waves, and this time they decided to hit South Korea. The banks, the government websites, information security companies, which I found interesting. I mean, that sounds like a great way to, really rile your competition up. Basically the U.S. and to a certain extent North Korea, they worked together to contain this and to filter out where the packets were coming from and shut it down rapidly so North Korea doesn't get a cookie. They didn't really do a good job attacking 2 of the most technologically advanced civilizations on the planet. Oh well. So, now that we've gotten some idea of what attacks Clarke is thinking about while he's writing this, like I said earlier, he's hypothesizing even worse attacks, but he doesn't provide any evidence to back this up and falls back on the trust me, it's secret, etc. Which I personally hate. I mean, as a scientist, I don't like, just trust me as an argument or data or anything. He also points out that about 20 some odd nations are currently they either have organized or in the process of organizing military units that are capable of conducting combat operations on networks. I guess it's currently the U.S. Strategic Command, but it was originally called Cyber Command, and I just love the term. It's just the hubris of it amuses me. Kind of like Space Command. We are going to be in charge of space, or the internet. Good luck with that one, Air Force. More on that later. But and like one of them is the U.S. Navy 10th Fleet, which was used as signals intelligence and basically code-breaking unit in World War II. That's been reactivated and now has a worldwide portfolio. And South Korea has these units. Russia has a ton of them. North Korea, of course. China has a ton of them. A lot of European nations like Germany and France and the UK have started several. But what concerns him is that all of these units are basically building up an offensive capability. They're not looking at trying to mitigate the effects of their counterparts coming in, who are attacking them. There's no defense. He also likes to frequently connect his previous work on nuclear war scenarios or war games or policy, that he's done a lot of work on that. I'm not really thrilled with where he goes with that, because I think that ultimately the mindset that he has from the Cold War is handicapping him here. That from the pretty much from the very beginning, everyone knew what nuclear weapons could do. There was the examples of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so in that situation, deterrence works. I've got this big weapon. It's going to hurt if I launch it at you. Oh, you've got one too. Okay, why don't we not do this? Basically, I've long seen the Cold War personally as a very defensive-oriented space, that everybody's deploying all these weapon systems so that someone else doesn't attack them. But in contrast, on the net, you're kind of in a situation in Dr. Strangelove where the Russians have their Doomsday device, and they don't tell anyone about it. Everything's secret. Nobody knows who's got the huge weapon. So what's the deterrent effect of a weapon you don't know about? And so I very much see it as, I think if militaries are conducting attacks like this, it's going to be a space where offense wins. Whoever starts first, and at least at this point, I mean, it's possible we can develop defense for this at some point. But right now, I mean, in the examples we've seen, the only one that didn't work so well was North Korea versus the U.S. And that was because of the asymmetry of their resources and ours. Although Clarke postulates enormous attacks on the U.S. that are basically, trying to think how to describe, well, I would say similar in magnitude to something like the blackout of 2003, which was essentially an emergent phenomenon, even though I think Al-Qaeda tried to take credit for it. Basically, he's fearful of some the digital Pearl Harbor, whatever. I think that was what Cheney called it. And spends a lot of time talking about how vulnerable we are, and also talking about what the government is actually willing to defend, even though they're claiming to the Department of Defense protect us all. Well, yeah, Cyber Command is going to take care of defending .mil, and Department of Homeland Security, which is supposed to take care of defending the rest of the network, is just going to defend .gov because that's all the budget they have. I kind of ruefully wondered how much they would have for this project if they just did away with TSA.
No, we don't want to be strip searched every time we open a web browser.
Well, I wasn't saying that they're going to be
You just back half the table with a different opinion.
This is part of the table. We just saw that website you're at. Please come with me.
That's what I'm saying. At least you don't have to use handcuffs on. You're just telling us.
And what's interesting about all of this, I didn't include it here, but it was another article I had read, and that's why I've got the ONOs, the rest of us are on their own, is that after this information came out, someone very senior in the government, I wish I could remember who, basically said, if there is a cyber war, it will be won or lost in the private sector because that's where all the talent and expertise actually is.
But you've got your whole, what comment?
See, that's what I'm talking about. But that, you know, it's possible that .mil goes down and, you know, .org stays up. So, and he's got a lot of doomsday scenarios, which, you know, are very emotionally affecting when you're reading them, but then if you're skeptical like I am, you start thinking about it after a while and you start getting angry, which...
Hello, people on the line. We apologize for that. Korea. North Korea, it's really a long story.
It must be the only thing you get to.
We would have
Okay, so now moving on to the doomsday scenario, now that we've taken care of North Korea. An unspecified nation, not North Korea, has thoroughly penetrated our military, electrical power, pipeline, telecommunications, and every other network we have. And I mean every other network. He doesn't leave anything out. And they planted logic bombs. They may have done this months or years ago. And then at some point, they decide strategically they want to just pop them all off. So they activate every single logic bomb they have in all of these systems, which plunges the East Coast into electrical blackouts and Washington, D.C. into chaos. Oh, by the way, in this scenario, you are Richard Clarke. You are a national security advisor to the president working in the West Wing. And so, you know, it's a far-fetched scenario, right? So, and you know, the black SUV pulls up, and they tell you that they need to take you to the secure, like, command center. And on the way, you know, the traffic lights are messed up. And I'm picturing something, a movie that needs to star somebody like Will Smith, you know, to save them. Maybe it's Bruce Willis. Maybe it's both of them. Yeah, there you go. All those guys, all of them.
Oh, yeah.
And the masseuse.
And you know, and so when you get to the command center, the power goes out, and all of your big screens die, and only a few of them come back on. You don't have power. You don't have communications. Pipelines are exploding. Chemical factories are leaking vast clouds of lethal chemicals. Power plants are damaged beyond repair. Satellites are spinning out of their orbits. As a physicist, I like that one. We'll get to that in a moment. And the administration is basically paralyzed, unable to respond. You know, it's basically the network war version of the end of Dr. Strangelove, that they're just sitting there watching it happen and they can't do anything.
You have a question from the channel?
Sure.
Would this impact Netflix?
I'm thinking that, well, I said all our networks, so yeah, so Netflix is in there.
Even Netflix.
Even Netflix. We get terrible.
Amazon down? Nobody can take Amazon. Well, we told them all from
And so these are systems that I'm actually familiar with. Well, not the KH-11 so much, and so I'm going to use these as examples of why I think Clarke went way off the reservation with his little scenario. We're going to look a little bit briefly at civilian nuclear power plants, particularly Fermi nuclear power plant, which I had the opportunity to tour through several years ago before September 11th. We're also going to look at satellites, which don't spin out of their orbits, like the Hubble Space Telescope, and by proxy, KH-11 spy satellites, because the same company built both of them. And you want to know why the Hubble didn't see so well the first time around? It's a little bit longer than the KH-11. They used the same library.
Ooh.
That's what the problem really was. Yeah, I met, well, for a while I worked for a couple scientists who used Hubble data, and I had the opportunity to meet the guy who designed the Wide Field Planetary Camera 2. He told me the story about the president of Lockheed inviting him to lunch and telling him not to say certain things that he'd figured out because he was starting to talk about how all the parts on Hubble, you could put them together in a different way, and they would still work. And so, yeah, the rest of the aerospace community wasn't too happy with him. And we'll cover amateur radio satellites and by proxy communication satellites in general. So, civilian nuclear power plants. First thing you need to know is they have incredibly strong physical security. There's a perimeter security that you have to go through, and if you don't have a good reason to be there, guys with badges and guns. And that's, you're a good, mile or so away from the maybe not that much, but I mean it was a long, we drove for a long way past the perimeter security before we got to anything that was inside the complex. And there were other layers of security and fences, and they had, barbed wire, concertina wire, tensioners on the bottom, which I was impressed by, because most places forget that. And then at the time we were there, I was actually a minor, which was a problem because that meant that we weren't allowed inside the reactor complex itself by federal law. They don't want the kids getting mutated. But they had, what we were impressed by was they had like a couple, maybe 3 dozen guys standing around the inside of the perimeter of the reactor complex, dressed like, basically like 80s SWAT team, not really body armor, but they were all carrying M16A2s at port arms. Nice. Like, they're loaded down, that they're carrying fully automatic weapons to guard the reactor. And the reactor is controlled by triply redundant mainframe computers, old IBMs from the 70s. And they're air-gapped. So, considering that it's from the 70s and it's an IBM, good luck with that USB thumb drive to cross the air-gap, guys. And one of the things they did show us was their training facility. They've got a complete mock-up of the reactor room that they can run. Basically, they can put their engineers and their technicians to hell, with any kind of simulation they want as far as the reactor going off the reservation. So, I mean, I was pretty cool with nuclear power before I arrived, and afterwards I'm like, I have no problems living, less than 40 miles away from this thing. I really think it would be, highly, I can't conceive of the attack that one could use via a network to, cause Fermi to melt down or have an excursion or whatever. So, I mean, that's where I think Clarke was like the idea of all these power plants being just knocked offline and permanently destroyed. To me, this is the worst case scenario around here, and I don't see it happening. So I'll move on to satellites, and I'd just like to point out they're governed in orbit by Newton's 3 laws of motion, which are, inertia, body in motion tends to remain in motion unless acted upon by an outside force, or it stays at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. For every force, there's an equal and opposite force, things like that. And contrary to Clarke's claims in the book, they do not keep enough fuel on board to use their maneuvering thrusters to propel them towards Jupiter. He literally said that. Specifically Jupiter, yes, specifically Jupiter.
Smiley face after that?
What? No smiley face. He was serious.
It's really another Clarke at that point.
Yeah. and what he put me in the mind of is there was there were 3 or 4 satellites that were launched in the late 70s, early 80s called International Magnetosphere Explorers. And later on in the 90s, NASA realized that they could take one of these satellites, which was still operational and still in orbit, and if they fired it on a trajectory to where it would go closer to the Earth, it could do a gravity assist around the Earth, head towards the Moon, do a gravity assist around the Moon, and then rendezvous with the comet. And so this basically, it was a, this satellite had already completed its primary mission, and with its tiny little maneuvering thrusters, they were able to do that. But they was that basically they burned all the fuel out of it just getting it out to the comet. So the idea of a satellite by main force deciding, I'm headed towards Jupiter today, go! No. The other thing is the best practices of satellite control, the console's air-gapped, and human operators are monitoring what's going into the satellite. They're very, very, very serious about this. I really have never put much stock into the stories of like 13-year-old hackers with their Commodore 64 somehow moving a satellite around, because that's just not how it happens. What?
The enemy of the state was wrong?
I'm sorry to burst your bubble. I'm sorry to burst your bubble, Len, but yeah. And if the payload has a radio channel, the control channel of the satellite is completely different. You can't just, connect via your DirecTV receiver or that sort of thing and get into the control side of the satellite. You might be able to get free cable, though. I don't know. Who knows?
Probably not.
And so the satellite that I'm really familiar with is the Hubble Space Telescope, because I did some work with it in undergrad. And basically, this is their procedure for how you get data off of the telescope. First, they need to know you. You need to have a grant and have published some papers and stuff like that. At one point, there was an amateur astronomer program that people could apply to use the Hubble as an amateur. I think that lasted all of like 3 months. But basically, you have to be part of the community first of all, and then you have to send in a request for observation time, and that's vetted and scheduled and put into the roster. And you don't have access to the control. You're sending an email. It's not really sexy, but that's how it's done. And you have to reference the Hubble GuideStar catalog. And then trained operators are the ones who are converting the requests into commands and then uploading these commands to the telescope. And once your observations are taken, then again, it's not really super cool, but they tell you, oh yeah, it's on the FTP site. Here's the file name. Download your data. And since I was an intern, guess what job I was doing on this side? I was sending the email, and I was getting the stuff off the FTP site. So yeah, it's a very, very remote control kind of process, and I would assume that the KH-11, since they're similar, are controlled in a similar, if not more secure fashion, because they're basically Hubble Space Telescopes that point towards the Earth. And the other satellites I've worked with are the amateur radio satellites, and basically anybody with an amateur radio and the correct type of antenna, which is usually circular polarized, or you can use a Yagian sheet and kind of twist it as the satellite goes across the sky. But you can interact with, essentially what most of these amateur satellites are, they're just an orbital transponder. So people are pointing their antennae at them and they're connecting with other hams via voice. Although some satellites have what's called an APRS data link, where you can send events to it, so you can tell it that my position is this on the Earth, and I've got this event going on, and that'll show up in other people. It'll relay that to other people who are also using the data channel, or slow scan TV. The other thing is the biggest amateur radio satellite up there right now is the International Space Station. It's got amateur radio gear, and so they'll frequently show an image of like the camera out the viewport at the Earth or things like that that you can download via amateur radio. It's important to note that accessing the transponder does not allow access to the control features of the satellites. So you're just talking on it, you're not telling it where to go. And the satellite is equipped only with small thrusters for station keeping and orbital maintenance, so that you can keep the antennae pointed towards Earth and/or the solar panels pointed towards the sun. Important stuff like that. Not pointing the satellite towards Jupiter. And the control of the satellite occurs at a dedicated ground station, like, Johnson Space Center for the space station. And there's checks and balances on, operators putting the commands in there and making sure they're correct before they commit them to the satellite. Yeah.
We got a question in the channel about the Terra AM1.
Terra AM1.
The comments about China's access in 2007-2008, military exercises to assess controls.
Military exercises to assess controls. Terra AM1, that's one of the satellite radio satellites, isn't it? Again, I'm not necessarily saying these aren't impossible. I'm saying under best practices, this is, they're going to maintain control. I mean,
it's a big leap from I can DOS your website a little bit to move to Acme.
Exactly, that's exactly.
I can drop all your satellites out of the sky and have them hit you.
Yeah, or I can make them fly out of their orbit so that they're not useful to you. So that's mainly the point I was making. Does that answer the question? Or?
I'll let you know if you said anything.
Okay, so we'll move on then. And then there's another F.U.D exercise, really, called Exercise South China Sea. The scenario here is that the U.S. and China and Vietnam are facing off over the Spratly Islands, which are well outside of China's territorial waters. Vietnam might be able to have a legitimate claim to them. They're basically a shallow spot in the South China Sea, and if you take all the islands together and collectively pool their landmass, they have 12 square miles. And they're spread out over a couple thousand square miles of ocean. But everybody wants them because they're known to be rich in petroleum. So in this exercise, Vietnam and China are rattling sabers, and the U.S. decides to dispatch 2 naval carrier groups to the West Pacific. Cyber Command is on the job, and so they send Photoshopped email to Chinese generals of the Chinese aircraft carrier in flames, just to let them know that we're totally badass, I guess. And exactly, and then as a secondary measure, Cyber Command gets Canton prefectures, and I know there's it's not in Pinyin, it's something different, but I couldn't remember what the Chinese was, so I apologize to any Chinese speakers there. But they hit Canton prefecture's power grid to frustrate loading of Chinese troops onto their troop carriers. And in retaliation for that act, China decides to escalate the conflict, and they take out the power grids around every single major U.S. naval base that's involved in this. And as a result of that, the U.S. fears escalation and meekly stands down and sues for peace and sends a diplomatic mission over to China to see if they can work this out. I had a lot of problems with this. In the beginning, he tells us don't fight the scenario, just like he also says in the beginning of the book, technical people, I'm trying to make this for a general audience, so don't call me on any technical errors, and policy people, I'm trying to make this for a general audience, so don't call me on policy errors, and I'm like, no, wait a second, you can't have that both ways, or even either way. And in my opinion, in this exercise, because when you read it, it's very clear that what's happening is the people who are involved in it, who are playing Cyber Command and who are playing the U.S. government, and I guess there was someone playing China as well, they're very constrained by the people playing. They're playing the rest of the world, but they're also the referees. And so it seemed to me like the whole exercise was designed sort of with a political motive in mind of, hey, look, we're not ready for this type of combat. We need more defense spending. We need more cyber warriors. I don't know what. It kind of had an odor to it, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. I also thought that the U.S. decided too blithely to engage in what essentially would be viewed as an act of war. Like, oh yeah, we're going to just zap the power grid, no problem. That's not going to have any repercussions. No. And I also noticed that once the combat started, the way that the scenario plays out, the U.S. can't do anything right. They are the Keystone Cops. Everything goes wrong for them. And in contrast, China is awesome. China can see everything. They know where everything is. They know where all these systems are. They've already penetrated them. They don't have the fog of war. They don't have any confusion. They are spot on. And I'm like, this sounds like a bad Tom Clancy novel from the 80s. You know. And the other thing is, when the U.S. finally does get around to attacking Chinese networks, the Chinese decide to fall back on an old high-frequency radio network, but the U.S. has forgotten how to hack those because, you know, we forgot about Enigma and all the stuff that we did in World War II. We don't know anymore about this high-frequency radio. How does that work? How can we send bogus messages? I mean, it's even easier on high-frequency radio. That's how pretty much what the Israelis did, is they just called in, hi, we're your commander. We got the code word right. You know, turn your radar off. Okay, that's an order. You could do that to China once they're back on the radio. Now, granted, you know, you'd have to know their keywords or whatever, but it's possible. And so after he's decided to create all this FUD, he wants to remedy it. And he's big on securing the electrical power grid. I think that's probably a good idea. I don't know that his understanding of what needs to be done is correct. You know, he basically, he seems to exist in a cost-free world. Like, we can just completely re-engineer something as big as our power grid, and
the person that secure the power grid.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to paraphrase broadly, but no, he doesn't really mention SCADA by name, but it seems like he's kind of vaguely familiar with what SCADA might be, and he's very concerned that all of these control networks are actually on the internet, which I don't think that's exactly true, but that's his impression, is that all of this data flows over the internet, so we should segment it off. And I'm like, well, that's a good idea. You know, encrypt it. That's a good idea too. And then, in general, after you've got the power grid secure, he's all about regulations, which is why I've written there. Enact more government regulations to enforce compliance with the government regulations we already have, and the government regulations regulating those regulations. And this is way before CISPA, but it sounds exactly like it. You know, that we can just regulate our way to a secure, happy future on the network, and, you know, suddenly things like identity theft and network breaches, all that will be and DDoSes from North Korea will all be a thing of the past. I really don't think this is the way to go at all. I think that we need to be more mature about this and understand, realize that the government can do some things well, and there's other things that it really falls on its face with. And I think this is one of them. The other thing that he's really, 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 really big on is deep packet inspection, which is why I capitalize it. And he really wants that. He admires China's ability to segment itself off from the rest of the internet and to segment its own internal networks. And I think he forgot somewhere along the line that they're a police state. You know, that it's easier to do that when people don't have rights. And so he really wants deep packet inspection hardware at all the points where fiber optics come into the U.S. so that you can watch every packet.
Why don't we just ask China how to do that?
China should just tell them.
They're already doing it to us.
Yeah, it's like corporate. Corporate calls you.
Yeah.
We'll get a call in the middle of the night. Hey, look, your firewall is open. Can you fix that? Thanks. Click.
And later on, he also talks about, and this is actually a DARPA project, developing and implementing, in the book he's calling it the military protocol, to replace TCP/IP on the internet. And like we kind of, Tango kind of jumped to this one a little bit earlier, but he wants to separate the internet into separate networks with separate functions to compartmentalize the threats.
That'll work.
Well, yeah, that was.
We have that kind of. No, you have the GOD network, which is internet from the internet. You have,
Are you talking about Zipper and Nipper, or?
Azure GOD, and we had to build a completely separate network for it.
Yeah.
We have the SWIFT network, which is European banking.
Okay.
And that's completely air-gapped. So those already exist. You have Internet 2.
Yeah.
Where's that coming?
That was what?
Internet 2, it's between universities.
Yeah, that was 90. It was online when I was working at the Space Physics Lab in Ann Arbor, because that's downloading Hubble images over that was awesome.
Yeah.
I was like, 2 gigabits a second or whatever. Whoop.
Yeah, I got a little as far as I remember.
Like,
this is gonna be my house when I get one.
No, I knew that was going to be a special time for me, and it would never come again. So, I used my Internet 2 privileges to the hilt. But actually, one of the things that he brings up in the book, I didn't mention it here, was that there's the I don't remember what NIPR and SIPR stand for, except that the N is non-secure and the S is secure, and because but the secure version of that, zipper, because it's secure, they decided that they didn't need antivirus, they didn't need anything else like you would normally deploy on your desktop PC. And then they forgot that people have USB thumb drives. So malware got sneaker-netted across, and I'm assuming that's kind of how the malware got on those external hard drives that the Air Force uses for their mission data for the Predator drones, and then that's how the keylogger got into the Craich Air Force Base in Nevada, where they fly them all out of. So yeah, there's like keylogger software loose inside this top secret Air Force base that flies all the Predator drones. Awesome, huh?
Well, it's not even sneaker net. What I did back when consultant days, we were at the U.S. Central Command, and the nipper and zipper are the same desk.
Oh, so they literally have like consoles next to one another?
Yeah, computer to computer. So you thumb drive, you don't have to move your arm very far.
Okay, that's
move between the networks.
In some ways, that's good to know.
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
So I want to go into the military protocol, because this is just, now we are several layers down into Dante's Inferno. Developed by DARPA, just like TCP/IP. He wanted to allow authentication for every sent packet, and I kind of skipped it down on the list, but it'll require true 2- or 3-factor authentication for every user. And I personally don't have a problem developing this protocol and using it for the military. The thought of having to do this every time I use the internet, hell no. It permits prioritization of packets depending on the purpose of the communications. And mind you, this is the protocol. It might encrypt the contents of the packet. That's literally how I put it. He might want encryption. Yeah, pretty much.
So you want to keep that.
Plain text data that you absolutely certainly can't hide.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. And initially, he wants to roll it out for the Pentagon's networks, but eventually it would spread beyond to the rest of the net, to the rest of the internet. The best quote was, "Doing all this could stop most cybercrime, cyber espionage, and much of cyberwar." And I put in parentheses, if everyone adopted it. It could also use scanning technology to prevent anomalous activity, intrusions, identity theft, malicious software, etc. Yeah. Responses from the community. So Vint Cerf, who helped develop TCP, if I recall correctly, not anybody we need to worry about. He's worried that it would erode the open internet, that it would begin the process of carving the internet into subnetworks, and it would destroy privacy online. Other things he mentioned were like, what about dissidents in places like Bahrain or Iran?
We have a dissident network for them.
Yeah.
You got to register.
Yeah, you got to register.
Papers, please.
And it would destroy privacy online, which that's why I'm against it. Is I also don't want to see a network that has that much overhead. I mean, what am I going to be? We're going to be back to like what? The days of modems.
Yeah.
On our
28.8, man.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it'll really be 28.8 megabytes, but it'll feel like.
People finally start using my BBS again. It's going to be awesome.
They really should have kept on my HSP. Go for it.
Yeah, it's coming back, baby.
Go for it.
and then these two things weren't related in the book, but I kind of linked them together. But Jeff Moss at the 2009 DEF CON, which was, what would that be, DEF CON 14? Said DEFCON 16. Okay, I cannot math. It's the actual.
That'd be tweeted. I cannot math.
Well, hey, last night on Twitter, I just suddenly realized that wait a minute, a megagram and a metric ton are the exact same thing.
Yeah, well, I woke up, I was on call, and I was like, oh, check Twitter. I saw like,
but anyway, so Jeff Moss convened this meeting to a certain extent at the request of the government, and so he got all the old hands from DEFCON. There was about 30 people in it, and they were talking. The topic was, how do we deal with military threats on the internet and threats from foreign adversaries and things like that. And the overwhelming consensus around this table was, like, the feds were just appalled that most of these people in incident response were like, oh yeah, we never call you guys.
Nope.
Because
you give our shit away and it goes away and we don't get it back.
well, that's if they're concerned about you committing a crime. If you are the victim,
You'll take your stuff away, you never get it back.
really?
Yeah. How else are they going to do the forensics?
But that's production time.
no, but now wait a minute, though.
Back in the late 90s, I worked for a company that was one of the original 6 backbone providers.
Mm-hmm.
We got hacked. They came in through one system, went to every switch, or went to every router, erased the NV RAM, and then flashed the NV RAM, and rebooted boxes off of that.
Mm-hmm.
So we went down hard. They came in, they took every single piece of equipment we had. We had to go out and buy all new.
Damn.
Never got any of it back before the company went bankrupt.
Did that have was that a factor in the company going bankrupt, I'm assuming, or no? Okay.
The company sucked.
Well, one of my vendors' clients had a client who was coloing, and the FBI came in because they thought some malicious stuff was going on, and they seized the entire computer rack. Well, it's a colo.
Mm-hmm.
So their servers are in the bottom. The servers that the FBI were concerned about was the top, but they roll out the whole server rack. Great.
Well, yeah, because there could be a script on that server that detects it.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I had the opposite.
Same rack, do this.
I had the opposite experience, which was what most of the people in the book were talking about, that, they were compromised, they reported it to the FBI once, and the FBI is like, yeah, thanks, click. One of my computers was compromised, and I'm like, I guess I'm supposed to report this. I'm a naive young sysadmin. So I call the local field office, and I'm like, so, under section this, whatever, I'm supposed to report this. And they're like, they didn't even ask any questions. They're just like, thanks, never mind, click. And I'm like, okay, nice to know about that in the future. So I guess that their response varies between completely unhelpful and really unhelpful. And then I'd like to go on to responses from reality about this. As we all know, traffic on the internet is growing exponentially still. Cisco's research arm estimated recently that based on current growth, by 2015, merely trying to police, monitor, and filter just video content online will become technologically impossible, because at that point in time, several million minutes of video will cross the internet every second. And that's just one type of traffic. I found that in an article on Slate that was talking about how even if CISPA passes, it's probably going to be a dead letter, just because the government's not going to be able to do what they think they can do with it, because it's actually beyond them technologically now. Contrary to Clarke, I think deep packet inspection is a horrible idea because it's invasive to privacy, it degrades network performance, and and ISPs are going to hate it because what their customers want is more bandwidth, not less. Not more delays.
And they'll have to pay for the defect.
Yeah, and so those costs will be passed along. So we'll be paying $500 a month for internet access. That's
crap.
The internet peering into what we're seeing.
I know it's good week, but is my email going to tell you that?
And the response is, Len, we see you watching all the porn.
And a bit reduced down to pigeons carrying USB drives.
And then this is my final commentary. Weren't we supposed to be using IPv6 by now?
Yeah.
I remember 10 years ago in my networking class, they're saying you will be the generation of network engineers at Cisco who will transition all of us to IPv6, and that was a decade ago. So, this idea of the military. What?
waiting for you, Mark.
Yeah.
Well,
Everyone waiting for Mark.
that's the problem. I apologize. But, I just think that, considering that IPv6 has been well established and is not actually, we haven't moved to it yet, the idea that this military protocol is going to solve all our problems and everyone's going to move to it, yeah, good luck with that. And finally, this was the worst, most egregious technical error in the book. I know he said not to crucify him on this, but I'm going to anyway. I mentioned it in the podcast briefly. So he's describing IPv4 addresses and basically gets it right until his example, where he falls on his face hard into the concrete.
You'll say,
And
you have an inspection on that number.
And that's all I have. So we've kind of been going back and forth the whole time. So, but if there's any other questions or comments or suggestions on how I can make this better, I'm open.
I think it was very good.
Yeah.